In this video, I will talk about the genetic imperatives that all living things must follow and how they influence our behaviors, especially in groups. The first genetic imperative is to copy good genes. The second genetic imperative is to kill genes that cannot be expelled, which we'll talk about in the next imperative. And the third genetic imperative is to expel mutant genes, which we see as a toxin that are causing harm to organisms or the group. And the fourth genetic imperative is to absorb good genes by protecting against bad genes, like a cell wall. All organisms must follow these rules as they are essentially continuing life and keeping organisms competitive. Cultures also follow a similar process, but it is not as clear-cut compared to genes. The genetic imperatives operate at a group level, where a group of people or any other organism where multiple organisms work together to try and achieve these genetic imperatives as a group. This is because groups that form have more genes in common than they do with an outside group. Similar genes working together to fight different genes. Our body deals with infections using these genetic imperatives. For example, vomiting out a toxin, or an abscess being contained, expelled, and if that doesn't work, heated up through inflammation or a fever to kill it. This is why I'm going to call this whole process the toxin response. These genetic imperatives are followed in reverse order when a threat is moving into a cell or group. Contain the threat, expel the threat, and if it can't be expelled, kill it. Our bodies do this by cooking the organism with a fever, and as a last resort, try to reproduce with it, because if it has survived, it probably has better genes than yours. We can see groups of bees doing this to invading wasps, but it was also seen in humans when an expanding threat, like the Persians at Thermopylae or the Umayyads at Tunis, was contained at all costs, with many males sacrificing their lives to protect the genes at home. Another example of these genetic imperatives is in use was the Holocaust. Hitler and many other Germans saw the Jews as toxic mutants that were damaging the larger group. So first they contained the perceived toxin by putting Jews into camps. Then they attempted to expel them but weren't able to due to the policies of the USA, UK and Australia not accepting Jewish refugees. As the Germans started to lose the war, they started killing Jews en masse as they didn't want the perceived toxin to spread to other organisms. There are many more examples of the toxin response where one group vomits out or kills another group due to interactions between groups and organisms. It is also important to note that if a group comes in that is beneficial, they are typically contained and then absorbed into the organism or group. This is because the organism or group isn't damaging or considered toxic and or mutated. A good example of this would be the Chinese communities in the West, where they were contained but not expelled or killed because they were beneficial to the group. It is important to do this as it is seen as a way to gain adaptations for relatively little cost. In a way, the balance between mutations or bad genes and behaviors compared to adaptations or good genes and behaviors is what dictates whether an organism or group is expelled or killed compared to whether it is contained and then absorbed. One important thing to note is that mutations or toxic behaviors are a requirement for acquiring adaptations or good behaviors. Allowing a small group of organisms to be a little toxic can help build a resistance to the gene or behavior to an outside group that is more threatening or toxic will be better tolerated or defended against. This is basically what happened in Europe with Christians and Jews. The Jews were a small amount of toxin, and the mutation used to help build a resistance against larger, more threatening groups like the Muslims. We could also see the toxin response in the behavioral sink experiment, where rats were given ample food, which led to many mutations stacking up because there was no selective pressure. So the male rats eventually isolated the female rats and starved them to death. To finalize, all parts of these genetic imperatives are important in the toxin response and maintaining good genetic and cultural health. These imperatives could be described as imperatives of instructions, but that doesn't sound as good as genetic imperatives, so I'll use genetic imperatives instead. The examples I have given in this video should be enough proof that we follow fairly simple genetic commands that we have very little control over.